those of you viewing the live stream, thank you for joining us. Let's begin Net Zero Leaders Summit, Japan Business Conference 2021, towards a positive cycle of economic growth and environment protection. The Japanese government has formulated the Green Growth Strategy as an industrial policy to link positive cycle of economic growth and environment protection to the challenge of carbon neutrality by 2050, set forth by the SUGA administration in December 2020. This online summit aims to communicate the appeal of Japan's investment environment and efforts toward carbon neutrality. Today, we will proceed with the following agenda. Opening remarks. Welcome video message by the Prime Minister. Keynote speech by Mr. Masakazu TOKURA, Chairman of KEIDANREN, Japan Business Federation, titled Japanese Businesses, Initiatives Towards Carbon Neutrality. Panel Discussion 1, Green Innovation. Panel Discussion 2, Sustainable Finance. Panel Discussion 3, Transition in Emerging Countries. Video message by Mr. Hiroshi KAJIYAMA, Minister of Economy, Trade and Industry. We hope you will stay with us until the end. To start off the event, we will have opening remarks by Mr. Nobuhiko SASAKI, Chairman and CEO of JETRO.
Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to extend a warm welcome to you today at the Net Zero Leaders Summit. I am Nobuhiko SASAKI, Chairman of JETRO, the organizer of this event. In this summit, we will discuss a net zero path for the world. To achieve net zero, or the goal of carbon neutrality, we need to combine new ideas, technologies, funds, and know-how more than ever before. We are holding this summit as an opportunity to express Japan's commitments to realize this through international cooperation. In addition to the commitments made by the Japanese government, the world's leading industry leaders who will be speaking today will also share their visions and commitments toward carbon neutrality. To all of you participating today, in order to make net zero a reality, we also need the strong will and determination of each of you. Everyone from government and industry, from Japan and overseas, I hope we can work together to create a net zero world. With that, let's get started with the program.
Thank you, Mr. Sasaki. Next, we would like to show the welcome video message from Prime Minister of Japan, Yoshihide SUGA, for this Net Zero Leaders Summit.
内閣総理大臣の菅義偉です。本日、ネットゼロリーダーズサミットが開催されることを大変嬉しく思います。今ここ東京ではオリンピック競技大会が開催されています。万全な感染対策を講じ、安全・安心な大会を実現する決意です。世界が新型コロナという大きな困難に直面している今だからこそ、この東京大会では世界が団結し、人類の努力と英知によって難局を乗り越えていけることを世界に向けて発信していきたい、このように思います。またこれから開催されるパラリンピック大会を通じて、障害にある人もない人も、みんなが助け合って共に生きるという共生社会の実現に向けた心のバリアフリーの精神をしっかりと伝えていきます。そしてスポーツの力を通じて次の時代を生きる子どもたちに夢と感動を味わってほしいと考えています。このネットゼロリーダーズサミットにおいても新たな技術や市場を切り開いている世界トップレベルのリーダーの皆さんにお集まりをいただいています。オリンピックと同じく世界の人々に夢と希望を与えることができるよう ポストコロナ時代の未来の姿を活発に議論していただくことを期待しています。このイベントのテーマである脱炭素社会の実現は人類全体で取り組むべき待ったなしの課題です。そしてそのための対応は経済活動の制約ではなく、むしろ新たな投資やイノベーションを生み、経済を持続的に成長させる原動力にもなります。こうした思いで昨年私はこれまで行政の縦割りによって踏み込めなかった2050年カーボンニュートラルを決断しました。そしてこの長期目標と整合的で野心的な目標として2030年度において温室効果ガスを2013年度から46% 削減することを目指し、さらに 50% の高みに向け挑戦を続けていくことを表明しました。こうした目標を掲げることには慎重な意見もありましたが、しかし私は新たに創設した2兆円の基金や税制措置、規制改革など、あらゆる施策を総動員すれば、必ずや民間企業の大胆な発想とイノベーションが産業の変革と力強い成長を生み出すと信じています。日本は脱炭素の実現に向けて世界のリーダーシップを取る強い意志と高い能力を持っています。これから我が国における大きなグリーン市場への皆様の投資や協力を大いに歓迎いたします。このイベントが夢と希望のある未来に向けて日本と世界が共に進む契機となることを祈念しています。
Thank you, Prime Minister Suga. For the keynote speech, we are honored to welcome Mr. Masakazu TOKURA, Chairman of KEIDANREN, Japan Business Federation. He will talk about Japanese businesses, initiatives towards carbon neutrality. With pleasure, we present to you Mr. TOKURA.
I'm TOKURA, the Chairman of KEIDANREN, Japan Business Federation. Thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to talk at Net Zero Leaders Summit. Historian Yuval Noah Harari said there are challenges that a single country alone cannot address, but demand global solutions. These are nuclear war, ecological collapse, and technological disruption. The theme of this summit, climate change, is one of major contributors to ecological collapse. In that context, it is significant that global leaders join together to discuss our common challenge to achieve carbon neutrality. I'd like to express my gratitude to the organizers of this summit. Recent years, natural disasters and extreme weather such as heat waves, torrential rains, and large typhoons are frequently striking many places in Japan and overseas, bringing about devastating damage both physically and economically. The business community has a strong sense of crisis, as climate change is the largest threat that can overturn the foundation of our business activities. For example, CO2 concentration has already risen to over 400 ppm level from the pre-industrial level of 280 ppm. Climate change is at a critical stage that we must address it right now. Otherwise, the atmospheric CO2 concentration will continue to rise and likely to reach a tipping point where global warming will become totally unstoppable in the near future. We have no luxury of time in order to save our rich global environment for next generations. Under such circumstances, Prime Minister SUGA upholds broad targets to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050 and cut greenhouse gas emissions by 46% by 2030. Japan is tackling climate change both in the public and private sectors under Prime Minister's strong leadership through initiatives to generate a virtuous cycle of economy and environment. Needless to say, achieving carbon neutrality is a daunting challenge. We need a radical change in use of fossil fuel that dates back to the Industrial Revolution. Renew the industrial production process. Innovative products and services needs to be widely introduced, and our lifestyle needs to be transformed. We must drive green transformation that is a fundamental transformation of our economic society. As an enabler of technological development and implementation, the Japanese business community is spearheading green transformation in close cooperation with the government, academia, and citizens. We are committed to make our utmost efforts to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. As you may already know, Japan's private sector addresses climate change with the main driver of proactive efforts by business community. The NDC Japan submitted to the United Nations includes proactive efforts by businesses. This is because for a quarter century, KEIDANREN has been promoting countermeasures against climate change and achieving concrete results. Therefore, I'd like to share outcome of the Japanese business community's proactive efforts so far and our challenges towards green transformation. As we all know, the Kyoto Protocol was adopted at the COP3 in December 1997. Prior to that, KEIDANREN had formulated the Voluntary Action Plan on the Environment. In this action plan, KEIDANREN member organizations set their own CO2 reduction goals and make voluntary efforts to achieve their target through a PDCA cycle. These efforts brought about 12.1% emission reductions against 1990 level during the commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol from 2008 to 2012, significantly contributing to Japan's commitment set forth in the Kyoto Protocol. Even after the Kyoto Protocol's commitment period ended in 2012, KEIDANREN did not stop our voluntary efforts and formulated the commitment to a low-carbon society in 2013. Since then, we have been making steady progress in emissions reductions through a PDCA cycle. The latest achievement in 2019 was a 10.7% reduction against the 2013 level. Of course, the climate change is a global issue that cannot be solved by a single country, nor by corporations only focusing on CO2 reductions in their own business area. To that end, the commitment to a low-carbon society includes following 4 pillars to maximize reduction efforts. 1. Emissions reduction from domestic business operations. 2. Strengthening cooperation with other interested groups in the entire life cycle. 3. Promoting contribution at the international level through knowledge and technology transfer. 4. Development of innovative technologies to enable greater reductions in the future. Japan's aim to become carbon neutral by 2050 is increasingly drawing global attention and expectation. KEIDANREN places the top priority on achievement of carbon neutrality. Having revised the commitment to a low-carbon society to the Carbon Neutrality Action Plan to accelerate our proactive efforts. More specifically, businesses participating in this action plan illustrate their own vision to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, constantly review their emission reduction target to make a greater contribution to achieve the government's 2030 target. KEIDANREN will strongly push forward our carbon neutrality action plan through engagement with the government and citizens to maximize our efforts to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. It is clear that carbon neutrality cannot be achieved with the extension of conventional measures. Businesses must be aware that climate change is a material management issue and keep driving innovations ever more aggressively. With this in mind, in December 2019, KEIDANREN announced Challenge Zero project to support businesses to advance their innovations. Businesses and organizations taking part in this project first declare innovation challenges that contribute to achievement of global carbon neutrality, then announce their concrete actions. There are 3 types of concrete actions as follows. 1. Development of innovative technologies. 2. Dissemination and implementation of such innovative technologies. 3. The financing companies that are engaged in the above challenges. We widely solicit KEIDANREN member companies and organizations to take part in Challenge Zero. Currently, over 180 members have announced more than 390 ambitious challenges, and the number is continuously on the rise. Special website for Challenge Zero carries innovation challenges of Japanese businesses. So please refer to details of their challenges in the website. I'm sure it will be a useful reference for those who are interested in innovations in the field of energy and climate change. KEIDANREN strongly promotes Challenge Zero, as we believe this initiative will change the game and create friendly competition of innovations. We are closely aligned with the Japanese government to carry forward Challenge Zero. For example, in October 2019, we started Zero Emissions Challenge in cooperation with the METI. This project lists up companies taking innovative challenges to realize the carbon neutrality in order to provide their information to investors. This is a government industry initiative to encourage financial institutions and ESG investors in Japan and overseas to invest in businesses pursuing innovation through Challenge Zero. The Japanese government also established 2 trillion yen Green Innovation Fund to financially support companies' innovation challenges. This program provides long-term 10-year support for research and development of key technologies essential to realize carbon neutrality, such as hydrogen, renewable, and nuclear energies, EVs, and CCUS. The business community is determined to take innovation challenges by taking full advantage of support framework like this. Companies making efforts to realize carbon neutrality should be properly evaluated by financial institutions and ESG investors at home and overseas, and receive investments to accelerate their innovations. In order to create this virtuous cycle, not only support programs like Zero Emissions Challenge, but also proactive and effective disclosures by companies are indispensable. The most well-known framework for climate-related disclosures is TCFD recommendations made by TCFD or Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures established by request from G20. Japan has the largest number of TCFD supporters in the world, with 428 institutions as of today. TCFD Consortium, sponsored by KEIDANREN, is a center place for pioneering activities, such as establishing guidelines to facilitate investment decisions by financial institutions and effective disclosures. The Japanese business community is building up best practices for disclosures based on TCFD recommendations and enhancing dialogues and engagement with financial institutions and investors in order to develop an environment to financially support challenges toward carbon neutrality. Last but not least, efforts to achieve carbon neutrality is absolutely challenging, but this is an inevitable issue for mankind. As I said at the beginning, climate change cannot be addressed by a single country, but requires concerted efforts among all nations in the world to protect the global environment, our social common capital, or global commons. The Japanese business community will continue our contribution in close cooperation with the government to achieve carbon neutrality through the initiatives introduced earlier, such as the Carbon Neutrality Action Plan, the Challenge Zero, and climate-related disclosures. I would appreciate your kind understanding and support for the Japanese business community's initiatives. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Tokura. Next, we will have a panel discussion on the theme of green innovation. The panelists are Mr. Benoit Potier, Chairman and CEO of Air Liquide; Ms. Virginia M. Rometti, former Chairman, President, and CEO of IBM; Ms. Kathy Matsui, General Partner of Empower Partners. Joining us via video message is Mr. Henrik Andersen, President and CEO of Vestas Wind Systems. The panel discussion will be moderated by Ms. Miki Tsusaka, Managing Director and Senior Partner of Boston Consulting Group. Over to you, Ms. Tsusaka.
We will now begin the Net Zero Leaders Summit. This first panel discussion will focus on green innovation. Hello, everyone. My name is Miki Tsusaka, a Managing Director and Senior Partner of the Boston Consulting Group. I'm both honored and excited today to moderate this important session. First, I'd like to welcome the panelists for this session, all of whom require little or no introduction, as they are global leaders in their sectors and bring great expertise and passion on today's green innovation topic. A warm welcome to Mr. Benoit Potier, Chairman and CEO of Air Liquide, who also serves as co-chair of the Hydrogen Council Worldwide; Ms. Ginny Rometti, former Chairman, President, and CEO of IBM; Ms. Kathy Matsui, former Vice Chair of Goldman Sachs Japan, and co-founder and general partner of Empower Partners. We've also interviewed Mr. Henrik Andersen, President and CEO of Vestas Wind Systems, whose remarks will be shared as part of this group discussion as well. So let's begin. Green innovation, arguably one of the most important things that need to happen right now as we imagine a net zero world. All of you have been playing an important part in encouraging innovative efforts combined with technology to make carbon neutrality a reality. I'd like to ask each of you to comment on what those strategies are and how you make it happen. So the first topic of discussion, what are indeed each of your thoughts around carbon neutral strategies? Let me share a video message from Mr. Anderson. Mr. Anderson of Vestas describes his strategic pillars for a carbon neutral society as a global leader in the wind turbine business.
First of all, thank you. I think the pleasure is all ours to be invited to participate in this panel. Miki-san, I will just here also like to honor and also appreciate the Japanese government, MITI, and not least Mogi-san, the General Director General in MITI, for the opportunity to participate. We are truly one of the global leaders in renewable energy and have been that for 4 decades. I also think here we all now appreciate that we have reached a part where renewable energy has to be part of the building blocks in energy source for our society going forward. Energy is vital, both for the generations that are picking up education, but also for our whole society to keep expanding in our lives, whether we live in the current countries we are in, or potentially also embarking on it in some of the newer societies coming in. We think large-scale deployment of renewable energy is super important. That is also why we are excited about to see how Japan is now embarking on a journey where carbon neutrality becomes 2050 goal. It's a very ambitious target, but we also want to volunteer and put Vestas forward as one of the Japanese government strategic tools to realize that ambition. I think it's important in that journey that we appreciate that the low-cost renewable energy, electricity is only 20% of the energy consumption today. So we will have to do more in electrification. That means electrification of transport, electrification of industry, and not least also how we can continue electrifying all around the renewables. It's also important that we are driving an increased deployment of renewable energy. Let's not forget that only around 9% of the global electricity generation today is based on the renewable, either a combination of wind and solar. So that we also have to pick up in the coming decades. Last, I'm honored a little bit to talk about Power-to-X and hydrogen in a Japanese context. I think you were the first ones that tried to convince the world to embark on the hydrogen fuel 20 years ago. And I think the world is now probably accepting that you were right. And now we're all embarking into the P2X journey. And we believe that will be a very, very important tool for industries around the world. So I will just finish on that one, just say we are really looking forward to help work closely with the Japanese government, your leader, Prime Minister SUGA, and also MITI in localizing when it comes to Japan and on the renewable transition we are embarking on.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Mr. Potier, over to you now to describe Air Liquide's strategic pillars towards a carbon neutral society. You've been very engaged in decarbonization in your sector as a leading industrial gas company. Perhaps focusing on the hydrogen business, can you share your thinking on some specific and innovative technologies and solutions that you're working on? Mr. Potier?
Yes, thank you very much. If I may start with what I call a carbon neutral society and when is it possible in general. I think we can have a carbon neutral society if we can collectively address 5 issues, essentially. Number 1 is a smart energy mix. The energy mix today is changing, and we need a sound energy mix that can fulfill the needs of both the planet and the citizens. Referring to renewables, solar, wind, bio, nuclear in some countries, gas with CCS, and many others, which really raise the point of acceptability of those renewables to people. That's one. The second one is a fair carbon price. Mechanism that needs to be put in place needs to lead to a sort of carbon corridor with a floor and a cap, which is not yet the case. So there's a role for the states to play. The third one is a real an accelerated decarbonization path amongst many industries that would allow a sort of transition phase for probably the next 15 years and leading to really low, very low carbon industries. So is to really address the issue of CCS. The number 4 is a faster development and deployment of hydrogen technologies. And I'm sure we're going to talk about them in different markets. And finally, I would say the complementary role of the financial sector. So those are the 5 issues that we need to address if we want to have a carbon neutral technology. Now, let me just come back to hydrogen. The hydrogen momentum has grown tremendously and worldwide. We have now 30 countries that have announced hydrogen strategies. We have 75 countries representing about 80% of world GDP that have announced net zero emission strategies, and more than 350 projects around the world, representing about $150 billion of investment. So really there's a new momentum in hydrogen. What we need is scaling up. What we need is public policies, sound public policies that help reduce the cost differential with the existing cost today, sort of cost parity, and we think the cost parity with fossil fuels is achievable in a reasonable time frame. The only missing point, and I will probably stop there right now, is the availability of renewable energy. I think we do not have enough renewable energy. And when we account for that, we see there is an issue. So I will just stop there to describe what we need and where we are in hydrogen.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gauthier. 5 things: hydrogen and renewables and the shortage of that. Ms. Rometty, let me pose the same question to you. IBM has, of course, been a leader in the digital world, and you've led from the front to marry good tech principles with practical applications everywhere. How do you think about carbon neutral strategies, and what specific solutions is IBM working on?
Thank you, Miki-san. And just as Benoit really talked about this at a society level, let me add to the conversation by talking about it from an individual company level. And I'd start with just a couple comments on the past, as I think it informs the future. So for IBM, believe it or not, it was 50 years ago that we had our first policy on the environment and its protection. So it's clear it's always been a long-term initiative to us, and it's weathered good cycles, bad cycles in business, ups and downs in the economy. And frankly, we focused on it when it was not popular as a topic. And so a few of the milestones, when I go back in time, so not only was that 50 years ago, the first policy, it was 1973 that we had our first program to manage energy, 75, our first conservation goal. It was 1994 when we actually started doing our public reporting. We may be one of the longest public reporting companies on this topic. 2000, our first CO2 emission reduction goal, and then we've had many more since that time. And then in 2020, we reached our most current goal 5 years ahead of time. So all I say that for is to bring us to, so what do you do going forward? And it was February of 2021 that we announced a couple points. One, that we would reach as a company net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. We would procure, into the topic that Benoit was just talking about, 75% of our electricity as renewables by 2025 and 90% by 2030. But maybe what I can share that from a company perspective is our philosophy behind that, and so on, and what you do. So my first comment is, though, the first thing to do is to conserve versus look at how to remove. And obviously the most environmentally friendly thing to do is don't consume it to begin with. And in many ways, it's been ingrained in us. It's the idea of when you build a product, instead of trying to reduce the cost of maintenance, you try to build something that doesn't need maintenance. And it's the same philosophy here. So first order is to conserve. The second philosophy would be to aggressively procure renewables. Now, we did our first renewables in 2001, believe it or not, and we're at 65% now. My third comment in philosophy is about being transparent and authentic. And so as an example, we don't use unbundled renewable energy certificates, RECs. We would not consider the purchase of carbon offsets as a way to achieve our reduction. And then the last point I'd make is that you have to bring it alive every day in what you do through your products, your research, and how you work with clients. And as an example, we've got a very interesting project going on with Yara. They would make nutrition for crops farming. And it's a platform that does everything around water conservation, fertilizers, et cetera. So you bring it alive through what you do in the industry. So that would be our philosophy, those 4 points.
Excellent. 50 years. Wow. So 2030, I'm sure you'll get there, or perhaps you'll break the record and get there sooner. Next up is Ms. Matsui. We have heard some great strategies by corporate leaders from around the world towards achieving their goal of a carbon neutral world in their companies and society at large. Let me ask you this, as someone that's operated, of course out of Japan, but always on a global stage, I wonder if you can comment on both public and private strategies and technologies that you see unfolding here in Japan today.
Sure. So I would say in a nutshell, Japan is moving in the right direction, but it's still got a very long way to go. As many of you know, Japan depends on fossil fuels for 90% of its energy needs. And while it has been one of the more energy efficient developed economies in the world, that very high dependency means it is still a great cause of the CO2 emissions globally. And so finally, belatedly in my personal view, the Japanese government announced a carbon neutrality goal to be reached by 2050, which will require reducing fossil fuel usage by as much as 48% by the year 2030. Alongside this, the government announced a green growth strategy, which includes a 2 trillion yen green fund to promote innovative R&D and CapEx, tax incentives to promote new innovations, financial support, regulatory reform to facilitate the development of new technologies, and finally, stronger international collaboration. They're targeting many areas for innovation, including offshore wind, hydrogen, nuclear development, transportation, new mobility systems, electric vehicles, residential and commercial conservation methods as well. But in my personal view, to really spur green innovation, the government's role is very limited. It really, at the end of the day, has to allow and promote private sector with incentives on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and then to ensure that no constraints are placed on the private sector on how those reductions are actually achieved. I think that going back to Mr. Pottier's earlier comments, what Japan, in my personal view, could do to really accelerate this process is, for example, mandate disclosure requirements of climate risks for companies. I know the UK's Bank of England is starting to do this in the UK, and this could be something to spur faster and accelerated progress here in Japan. We also need greater financial support. I said 2 trillion yen, there's a 2 trillion yen green fund. That is 1/100th that of the 2 trillion yen green infrastructure fund that the US government is planning to pursue. So still very, very small scale. And finally, removing regulatory barriers, I think, is also of utmost priority. But I think the direction is clear. It's moving in a positive way, but still has to be accelerated in the next few years. Otherwise, it won't be reached.
Thank you, Kathy. I'm glad we're headed in the right direction. Those are sobering statistics. I fully agree with you, and I think others have already commented on the importance of transparency, disclosure, and making all of this come out so we can all visibly track those goals and move forward together. I'd now like to move to the next question for all of you on how then you make such strategies a reality and ensure the strategies really come to life especially given the 2030 goals that many have already committed to, which feels increasingly just around the corner? Here are remarks from Mr. Anderson of Vestas on this question. I asked Mr. Anderson how he plans to achieve the goals of carbon neutrality within the walls of Vestas and also broader partnerships and ecosystems. Let's have a look.
Yeah, first of all, it's something where I've been now, first I was a non-executive director with Vestas since 2013. I will say probably some of the most rewarding things we have seen in our journey has been the last 10 years in the industry. In the last 10 years in the industry, we have reduced levelized cost of energy of wind with nearly 2/3. It also meant when we look back to 2010, we were basically depending on subsidies in 90% of the world markets. Today, it's the complete opposite. We don't rely on subsidies anymore. And that means we have removed, I think, one of the most probably upsetting factor discussing renewable energy, the financial factor. So today, politicians and global leaders can take that active decision. And I will just say, if we look at it and compare it, if we invest $10 million in fossil or existing fuel sources, we generally create 15 permanent jobs. If we invest $10 million in renewable, we create somewhere around 70 to 75 permanent green jobs. And I think the generation to come after us would expect us to leverage that ratio for the future. So for us, we very much believe in that this is a global business, but it also requires a lot of local ownership, both in terms of developing the technology. All countries, all areas are to some extent different. So therefore, we adjust and we establish ourselves locally. In this case, we have a very, very strong partnership. One of our largest shareholders is MHI, and I have Ken-san Osumui Kentaro, Ken-san between me and him on my board as one of my board members. So we actually work very closely in establishing that. We can't do that alone. So we rely heavily on establishing local partnerships, both on components, but also at a later stage on the local partnerships when it comes to manufacturing. Especially in Japan, we have, together with the METI and the government, developed and outlined a Vision 2040, which of course relies on that we have visibility of the auctions and the transition happening in Japan. On the other hand, the government in Japan can then count on our commitment of being local manufacturing footprint and taking some of the young people coming out from technology and universities into our journey as well. As a large company, we have launched similar, that we will become carbon neutral in 2030, and we will have a complete circularity in 2040. I was insisting on that originally when we start talking about it, everyone were talking 2040, and I had to say, it sounds very wrong. I'm more than 50 years old, and I don't think I'll be around in 2040 to sort of. So it felt very much that we were passing something on to the next level of leaders, rather than saying on the carbon neutrality for Vestas, it's 2030, because I need to get that done. So that is very much how we think, and probably also lead a little bit towards a question with is what do we do as large corporations to help governments and political leaders making it happen? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Mr. Portier, can you now share your response to the how question? How do you make all of this happen in and around Air Liquide and beyond to accelerate the set of transformations you discussed earlier?
I think everything starts with objectives. You need to have good objectives, and I think there's no surprise that Air Liquide has ambitious objectives, which were, by the way, presented to the market this year in 2021 under a Sustainability Day. So number one, carbon neutral by 2050, which is the goal. Midterm, we have set an objective of reducing by 1/3 our absolute CO2 emissions by 2035. And before that, in 2025, we need to see our absolute emissions decrease. which is not yet the case because we have a sort of accumulation of projects, growth projects, that will translate into more CO2 emissions. So everything starts with the objectives. Then we have, on the how, we have an internal strategy on 3 points. One is the assets. We need to convert 100% of our assets, production plants, transportation, the way we handle our products everywhere, the way we distribute our products, we sell. So we have initiated a certain number of programs around our assets, number one. Number two is customers. We need to help our customers to decarbonize their own industries. And this is a very important part of our business. And so far, we've been pretty successful in talking to a certain number of sectors about how to achieve that. And number three is to actually work in ecosystems, because alone we cannot be successful. So assets, customers, and ecosystem, that's the ACE strategy. Now, a word on technologies. We are a technology company, so we are working on many different fields. On production first, we will improve the existing technologies, the so-called SMR and ATR technologies, to increase the efficiency and reduce the emissions. So that's just an immediate action. Then we'll work, and we are working already, on electrolysis technology. There are actually 4 big ways of electrolyzing water. There's one which is well known, a second one that has been introduced, and 2 that are already in the labs. So we will continue working on R&D to make the most efficient technologies emerge. We work on liquefaction of hydrogen, because this is really a key core competence of Air Liquide. We are working also on transportation and storage. My idea is that in the future, we should be able to store hydrogen in the pocket. As simple as that, in a sort of sponge. And there are materials that allow that. And Japan, by the way, is well advanced in this type of technology. And finally, we are also working on the CCS or CCU technologies, so carbon capture and usage, or carbon capture and sequestration. So an internal strategy with assets, customers, ecosystems, and a very deep work on technologies. That's the how. And with that, we think we'll be able to make it happen.
Thank you, Mr. Potier. Hydrogen in a pocket. I will remember that one, amongst the many other things you've talked about in terms of what you're doing at Air Liquide, the partnerships, and of course, importantly, the ecosystem that you operate under. Ms. Rometty, same question to you. What are your thoughts on how to make all of what you talked about happen within the walls of the company, the partnerships and ecosystems? Same question. Look forward to your response.
Thank you. And I'll speak to a number of the technologies, just as Benoit also mentioned. But when you speak about how, I would suggest that there are 3 principles when it comes to technology innovation that every company could adopt that would accelerate the usage of technology innovation in the whole area of carbon neutrality. So the first one would be to embrace what I would call an open technology ecosystem. And in some ways it's obvious, because without it, you can't harness data, and it's in so many different places. You'll never pull it all together. And we already all very well understand that if we can pull it together, we can achieve some much greater things than we can individually. Now that needs technology-wise an open cloud platform and a hybrid cloud. And some examples of that would be the Alliance to End Plastic Waste. So here's where they're creating a virtual single source of data across many different companies across 6 different continents. They've raised $1.5 billion to do this. And this is all around, I think we don't realize there's 200 million tons of waste in landfills, 8 million in our oceans, as an example of just plastics. Or in Europe, we're doing work with the electronic grid operators, and that's blockchain in this case, and it's to balance supply and demand, as an example. Now, that's this idea that you can't do any of this without an open platform underneath this for the ecosystem. The second principle I would suggest is that you've got to do something to break down barriers that you can have strong collaboration, because actually fragmentation is probably the greatest enemy to us achieving what we need to achieve here. And so therefore, to have integration, you really want to integrate between the consumers and the producers, which is obvious. And so as an example, in Japan, I think one of the very good initiatives is called the Advanced Semiconductor Manufacturing Technology Consortium. Now, this is hosted by, in Japan, the National Institute of Advanced Industrial Science and Technology. And it's all about jointly then developing some of these technologies with the government. It's just one example of many work Mitsubishi Heavy Industries is doing, which is about a platform that would use, again, a digital platform that you could visualize what you have for the capture, the utilization, and the storage of energy. So just an example. And then the third principle that I would end on that I think applies to everyone is this idea to focus on trust, because you will never accelerate the adoption of new technology if people do not trust it. And so many of these systems, as we've just discussed already in this panel, are rapidly digitized, and many will use artificial intelligence. But the biggest inhibitor to AI is people trusting that data. And by the way, AI will have a great use. I mean, we're doing it with polymer membranes to separate out carbon dioxide from flue gases, but you've got to trust the data and have principles around that. So the idea of an open technology platform, the second being radical collaboration, and the third being focusing on the trust of these technologies, the underpinning elements of why you trust them.
Thank you, Ms. Mermetti. 3 principles, very compelling and very convincing. Let me now move back to Ms. Matsui. Over to you with a slightly modified question. The others have just talked about how individual companies and their sectors are activating their efforts. Ms. Mermetti has just talked about 3 principles. Bringing the conversation back to Japan, I would love to hear your perspectives on what you see as strengths versus gaps in terms of how Japanese corporates are approaching green innovation in general.
Absolutely. So before I get to Japan, I just wanted to maybe set some context in terms of the opportunity for companies globally in the space of what I call broadly clean tech and green innovation. My former colleagues at Goldman estimate that clean tech has the potential to drive $16 trillion of green infrastructure and investments, and potentially could create 15 to 20 million new jobs around the world by 2030. By the way, of the $16 trillion, renewables would account for about 7 of the 16 trillion. So clearly an enormous opportunity in what we are living in, a low growth world. For Japan, this carbon neutral society also represents a tremendous business opportunity, of course, for Japanese corporations, which, as we know, have had a long history of developing energy saving technologies, just given how resource poor the nation is. And if I think about your question about what are some of the strengths, Mr. Portier talked about hydrogen. This is an area that Japan has had a leading edge in developing the science, fuel cell technologies. I think the infrastructure is still a work in progress, but the government in its latest basic energy plan is really prioritizing hydrogen very strongly. Second is with mobility and transportation, lithium ion batteries. We know a lot of the early batteries that went into the Tesla came from Japan. And there's just a lot more potential for growth, be it solar or wind, which the government's also going to be emphasizing to manage those supply-demand fluctuations. There's going to be huge demand for lithium-ion batteries. Offshore wind infrastructure, as well as next-generation electric vehicles, just to name a few other examples. However, in terms of the gaps that I see a few. Number one, Ms. Rometti put her finger exactly on the point that Japan still needs a lot of work on, which is this open innovation ecosystem. I think Japan still suffers from this disease of siloed academia, private sector, and the government, and we absolutely need to break those barriers down if we are truly going to maximize the potential of green innovation for the economy. So that's point number one. Point number two is scalability. I'm running a venture capital fund right now. We're coming across some really exciting technologies, but getting them from a really exciting idea to commercializing is quite a different matter. So how do we, and it's not a country lacking in capital, right? It's got a huge amount of cash sitting under the futon, but how do we deploy that capital in the right way so that these companies can scale, not just scale domestically, but scale globally? And then I would say, finally, going back to my disclosure point earlier, only 40% of the Nikkei 225 index companies actually have carbon neutral goals or targets set. That's way too low compared to the global average. So again, we really need a push, I think, from the government. We're already seeing it from shareholders to move faster on that front of transparency. So strengths, but still challenges ahead.
Thank you, Ms. Matsui, for the push. So thank you, everyone, for sharing your ideas, actions, and commitment to green innovation across such a diverse set of businesses, sectors, and economies that you all spoke so compellingly about. Be great now if we do a closing round of thoughts on the discussion we just had towards a net zero and greener world, and your messages perhaps to the corporate leaders around the world that embrace this shared goal as well. Here are Mr. Anderson's remarks. Please have a look.
Yeah, and I apologize always upfront when I answer this question a little bit, because I know I might upset a few of my colleagues in large corporations around the world, but I think it's about doing what you say you do. So in some countries we call it walk the talk, or talk the walk you do as a large corporation. I think we are obliged to do that. Otherwise, I hope the future generation will come back and remind me personally that I didn't do what I was talking about. Because if I look at it, the large corporations, we have 29,300 people working for Vestas. And if you want the vehicle that is named Vestas on today, it will have to be a hybrid or an electric vehicle. Why is that? Because if we continue down the path of keep talking about it and not having the decision, then we will never make it happen. And to give that example is a lot of leaders around the world are using the not yet built out infrastructure as the argument for not making the decision on behalf of your employees. We say it differently. We have now chargers at every location where Vestas works around the world with factories and others. That means if you cannot drive up and have your car recharged at our factory or office locations, then of course it's me that is the holding back. So for us, we also said to anyone, guests, people in the community, you can swipe your charging card and then you can charge your cars at our locations as well, either outside normal office hours. This is sort of just an example of saying, I really think that large corporates will have to play their part in providing, being part of the building out the infrastructure, but then also sticking to that we have the values to say to a large group, not only our employees, but it's also the families of the employees and the relatives of the employees that see what is actually the right thing to do. Maybe 10, 20, even 50 years from now, what is it for a society we would like? So therefore, we are very much relying on that. The other thing we also do is we don't know everything. So we invite very obviously to open partnerships. We invite to technology sharing partnerships where trusted partners will share development. One of the things, and we are having a little bit of successes right now, 2 years ago, everyone was super nervous for announcing that we could be running a full circularity and recyclability of the blades.
Yes.
Today, we can say we have 3 very good examples of that running globally with local partners. I know for sure Vestas can maybe only aspire to maybe hold and part of the ownership in one of these successful startups, but I can promise that some of those startups, if they're really successful, they will be as big companies as Vestas in itself, because then will then be one of the leading companies doing the recyclability of blades, which is becoming a more and more imminent challenge to solve for the whole industry, and also for a political leader that says yes to renewable. She wants to know that they can rely on that it's truly renewable as such. I think that's what inspires me tremendously, because we have one of the most renewable and one of the most sustainable products. One of our turbines is carbon neutral from 4 months of life, and it's expected to last for 30 years. So a little bit we are blessed from the beginning, but we will try to make those 4 months down to basically day one. That's the whole spirit of what we believe in investors. Thank you.
Mr. Potier, your closing comments, please.
Yes, maybe my first comment will be on long term. There is no long-term performance without first good economic performance today. And I think that's the starting point. And that's only if you have them that you can project yourself and think about the long term. So the combination of financial performance and sustainability performance is actually key for the future. And we in Air Liquide, we actually base all our long-term plans on the combination of the two. We cannot just ignore either one or the other. So that's my first remark. The second thing is about the roles that we have to play. We have the private sector, we have governments, and we have citizens, to make it very simple. The first thing we need to assure is that companies deliver. We have taken commitments, we need to deliver. We need to deliver in financial performance, but also in technologies, in sustainability objectives. And unless we are able to deliver, we are not going to be credible and things are not going to happen. So that's my first statement. We have our own homework. The second one is governments. Governments have a very important role to play, not to replace the private sector, of course, but to set up the regulatory framework to help the private sector to invest. So to play really a guiding role in the way the system is going to evolve. I was mentioning earlier the CO2 price. There's no way we as companies can set up a CO2 price. So the mechanism that needs to be put in place by government is very important. So everyone has a role to play. We have to go not alone, but in partnerships between companies, but between R&D, academics, and private sector, but also between private sector and governments. So this is why we as a Hydrogen Council have tried to play that role to gather as many sectors as we could and talk to governments so that we have the best regulations in the future. And finally, I think we need to also integrate citizens in what we do, because they will play a role. Either they accept this new world or not. And back to Virginia's point about trust, I think if we don't have the trust from citizens, nothing will happen. So it's also up to us to create that trust, not alone, but with the full ecosystem. That would be my concluding remark.
Thank you so much, Mr. Potier. Ms. Rometty, over to you.
I would close this panel, I think, with my 3 points I'd make to my business colleagues. The first one would be, do not look at this topic as a corporate social responsibility imperative, that this is a long-term strategic business imperative. And like any other imperative you have in the business, you'd set goals and you'd raise the bar every year and you'd achieve them and you would publish them and you'd keep moving forward. That'd be point one. Point two, I believe you should be very transparent and authentic. Now, I used the word trust earlier. I've always said that trust is a company's license to operate that society gives it. And so in such, to build trust, one way you can do it is to take a clear stand on something and then articulate it, but take a clear stand on something that matters to society. So just recently, we were very clear about supporting putting a price on carbon, on a particular plan that we would endorse, very clear that it would be the Climate Leadership Council's plan around this topic, but clarity on what you believe and be authentic about it. And then my third and last point would be that this now, every leader, every industry needs to respond. I think this was a topic that for a very long time, people felt the few could carry the many. And that's really no longer true. And I participated as one of the creators of something the Business Roundtable did called the Purpose of Corporation. Some people reduced that to stakeholder capitalism. But we talked about, in addition to shareholders, whether it's employees, society, communities, your clients, and of course, obviously underpinning all that is everybody has a stake in the planet. And therefore, this is all of our responsibilities.
Thank you, Ginny, or Ms. Rometty. Thank you, Ms. Rometty. CSR, authenticity, and of course, that it is everyone's responsibility. Really appreciate your thoughts. Last but not least, Ms. Matsui. Your closing comment, please.
Thank you. I'll close with two. First of all, I think this climate crisis that we're all experiencing is a true crisis. But at the same time, I'm telling corporate leaders, government leaders here in Japan, that it also represents a once-in-a-generation business opportunity. But to make this opportunity a reality requires the successful development and implementation of innovative, clean technologies that will require both government leadership as well as aggressive corporate investment. And my last comment is, while it all sounds so scary and impossible, I remain optimistic for the following reason. If I talk to my children who are in their early 20s or other Gen Xers, young people, I'm heartened by the fact that they are so passionate about their future, about this planet, and what they think needs to happen for this world to be sustainable, that much more than my generation, they really, really care. And therefore, what does that mean for employers? That means maybe you don't think the environment is directly, impacting you. You just use energy, but it's not your main business. No. Those people who are going to either choose you as a place to work or not choose you will be asking you that question. What is your impact on the environment? How are you managing those risks? These are front and center, top of mind questions that young recruits and employees will be asking. So if you want to be the employer of choice, this to me is absolutely integral in your, as Ms. Rometty pointed out, your business core strategy. But because I feel this magna of momentum of passion amongst this youth generation, I'm very excited about what that means for the future of this climate and clean tech opportunity that we face going forward.
Thank you, Ms. Matsui. I'm very excited as well. I was so excited, I think I misphrased what I meant to say to Ms. Rometty, which is it's not about CSR. It is about authenticity, and it is about all of us taking responsibility, not only as leaders, but for the next generation to come. So thank you. Thank you all for sharing your thoughtful insights and passions with us today. The world has a ways to get to net zero, but it's great to hear from leaders like yourselves that are at the leading edge of this dialogue. I was really struck by the really wide array at the depth of the arsenal of innovations, technologies, philosophies, resources, ecosystems you all spoke about across very different value chains, but also a strong commonality of your convictions and your commitment to make sure this all happens in an accelerated way for your companies and society at large. I've been energized by your energy and drive, and trust the audience feels that way as well. Thank you, Mr. Anderson, Mr. Potier, and Ms. Rometty and Matsui for this very important discussion today. Thank you.